Thank you for sticking around after the coffee break and coming back, some of you from early this morning. For those of you who weren't in the last discussion, there was a good sort of segue from our last conversation in which we were discussing new technologies and the increasing energy demands related to digital connectivity and AI, and whether or not our ambitious goals on that side actually match our goals on climate. So I think that as we had stated in the morning, we're looking at a very broad agenda and trying to understand how all those things are connected and bridged. And so that's something that was sort of organically came out of our conversation last panel. But so this is our third panel of the day. It's been a very rich discussion so far. We'll be discussing addressing climate change through just transitions. And I want to thank the moderator of this panel, my colleague, Jimena Roesch, Director of Global Initiatives and Head of IPI's Peace, Climate, and Sustainable Development. As many people engaged in climate, she is 1 foot here right now, 1 foot at COP already. And so we're really grateful to have her to moderate this panel. And I'm just going to switch over to her right away. Jimena, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, colleagues and friends. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to our panelists as well in the screen. I know it's fairly late for them, so thank you so much for being with us. I think that this panel is called Geneva Peace Week meets New York meets Dubai meets COP, because we are basically already there. The team is there, and I'll be heading there soon. So this is a timely event because it's a moment that we're bridging peace and security with climate, which is a fairly new theme in the COP space. For the first time, we'll have a day dedicated to this topic on December 3rd on health, recovery, and peace. And it's also the first time that COP will look at the global stocktake, where we will see how we're doing to keep under 1.5 degrees temperature. So it's a very important COP, to say the least. And also it's a COP that is taking place in a region right now where we're seeing immense suffering and intensity. So we are at a real tipping point, not only on climate, but also in the geopolitics. And we're hoping that climate, as ASG Hart, who was here a couple of weeks ago, said, we have to prove that through climate, multilateralism can still deliver, it can still work, and it can still be a place of deep collaboration. So amidst this like geopolitics, we do think that COP is a space for collaboration and partnership. We have some fantastic speakers here today. We have the DPR of Mozambique, Domingos Fernandes. We also have on the screen Christophe Hodder, the first ever advisor on climate security in Somalia. And last but not least, Catherine-Lune, head of policy team at the ICRC. So these are really 3 fantastic guests that will help us bridge what does just transition means in the climate space, connected to conflict, connected to peace, and most of all, how do we protect vulnerable communities in these spaces? These are people that are already in vulnerable situations. How do we make sure that we are visionary enough to support them through what the IPCC envisions as very difficult scenarios as we go to 1.5 degrees. So with that, I will go to Catherine first. You're in Geneva, and I know it's very late for you, so thank you so much for being with us. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, and I'll give some credit to Chris, who I believe is 2 hours later than me, somewhere between Somalia and Kenya. So thank you. I'm sorry, I missed the introduction because the sound was not working. So I'm hoping I'm not going to repeat anything that you said in the introduction. First, thank you for organizing this conversation. It's a pleasure to be part of it. I'm going to provide some remarks from the perspective of the ICRC, and that is a humanitarian organization that works in conflict settings and is not focused on peace, but focused on responding to humanitarian needs. So we're probably going to offer some complementary perspectives here. The reason why climate change matters to us as an organization is because the populations that we work with happen to be on the front line of the climate crisis. And that is because conflicts curtail the capacity of communities to cope with any types of shocks, including climate ones. And that's why when we look at stats, we see that the countries that are considered the most vulnerable to climate change and the least ready to adapt include a very large number of countries in conflict. So that shows us a stat of about 60% of the 25 countries that are the most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to a changing climate are in conflict. We started as an organization to focus on better understanding how converging climate risks, environmental degradation, and armed conflict are reshaping the lives of the communities that we work with in 2019. And then we started reflecting on what were the implications for our humanitarian response. In a nutshell, I'd say that we see that all dimensions of people's lives are being impacted, from their food security to their water security, to their economic security, to their health, and so on and so forth. And that this has significant implications for a humanitarian response in terms of rethinking how we integrate those risks to the way we frame typical humanitarian responses. Now, there are two things I wanted to flag in this discussion. The first of them is the interaction or the relationship between climate and conflict, as I think it's important that we all acknowledge the fact that there is not a linear relationship between climate change and armed conflict. In other words, climate change does not directly cause armed conflict. What we see is that climate change can have a highly disruptive impact on societies, but this may not lead to conflict. And in fact, if we look at scientific evidence, we see that cooperation within and among communities is the most frequent response to notably resource scarcity and not armed conflict. Now, I'm immediately going to add a nuance to this. We do know that strong governance capacity and inclusive institutions help countries mediate potential resources, potential tensions, and ensure an equitable use of resources. Now, these are capacities that tend to be lacking in countries in conflict. And there we can see that the impacts of climate change on people's livelihoods, on patterns of mobility, on competition over scarce resources may exacerbate tensions at a local level and may impact the dynamics of a conflict. So the question here, when we're looking at the interaction or the relationship between climate and conflict in settings that are already fragile, already conflict prone, should very much be around how can our responses nurture collaboration rather than exacerbate tensions. And there, I think we all need to bear in mind that there's no direct causality, and therefore it's not an inevitable relationship where climate change causes conflict. And that's something we need to factor into the way we think responses in conflict and fragile settings. The second point I wanted to focus on, and this connects to the justice and equity dimension of the conversation that we are having, is that I've just flagged that countries in conflict are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change. They also happen to be among the most neglected when it comes to climate action and climate finance, because of the very challenges attached to working in conflict settings. If we look at the commitments of states to leave no one behind or to help the most vulnerable adapt to climate change, these should be prioritized as countries in terms of support. Now, I would argue that this is a reality that needs to change, and we are able collectively to bring some changes in these environments. And I'm quite convinced that Chris will speak in part to some of this with examples from Somalia. We published last week a report that's called Weathering the Storm that looks at some of the ICRC experience in working to strengthen the resilience of conflict-affected communities to climate risks. We've been documenting experiences in Niger, in Mozambique, and in Gaza before the current escalation. And what we're able to show there is that it is possible to develop responses that will contribute to building resilience at a local level, working with local communities, working with local authorities, working with local service providers. It does entail that we adapt the response to the environment that we work in, but I would argue that this is the case in any environment. So this entails taking into account the specificities of working in a conflict setting. The main argument there is that it is possible and collectively we can make this work. Now, I'm not going to say that it is simple. If we're looking at pathways to climate adaptation, these are not even clear in stable environments. So when we're looking at conflict settings, we are looking at a situation that is even more complicated. But there I'd flag a few points in terms of what we need to consider when we're working in conflict or fragile settings and looking at how do we strengthen climate adaptation or resilience to growing climate risks. First, and that is very much stating the obvious, but we need to develop responses that take into account the specificities of the context, recognizing that responses that are developed in stable environments are likely to be ill-suited to unstable environments. And that is true when we look at different countries, but it's also true inside a country where you will have pockets of greater stability and pockets of greater instability. And that needs to be taken into account when we are looking at responses. Second thing, we need to take into account, and this is particularly true in conflict settings, the social and political dynamics that are at play. Because if we are blind to the fact that when we support certain groups or when we provide support in certain locations, the results might not be the same for all inside a country or inside a community, and that our action may be impacting dynamics of power and dynamics of vulnerability, we could be fueling tension and we could be fueling conflict. And we could also be supporting an action that might yield maladaptation as a result. So that's important when we are looking at how we frame our response. The last point I would emphasize in terms of how do we frame responses is the fact that, and it connects to being aware of social and political dynamics, but we also need to be aware of the fact that vulnerabilities are created in a certain environment, and we need to understand what are the root causes of these vulnerabilities if we want to develop adequate responses that will help people be more resilient to climate risks. So for instance, when we're looking at societies, we need to be able to understand why certain people have settled in flood zones, why certain people are farming on fertile lands, and this very much connects to the place of people in societies and areas where specific vulnerabilities might need to be addressed if we want to be developing adequate responses that will help addressing current but also future risks in society. So that's very much understanding the various segments of a society and how can we be providing adequate support. I will just conclude here by insisting on the fact that if we are considering climate action through the prism of equity, we need to be looking at how do we strengthen climate action in conflict settings. I insist again on the fact that it is possible to strengthen the response in these environments, and that entails that we join forces. I also insist on the fact that while a humanitarian response can lay some foundations towards strengthening resilience to climate risks, it is not sufficient and therefore really entails a broader collaboration. Lastly, and I think I heard you alluding to in your opening remarks to COP28 that is starting now, we very much welcome the fact that there is going to be a discussion on relief, recovery, and peace that will discuss conflict and fragility for the first time on the official agenda at COP. And that's an important development in recognizing that conflict settings and fragile settings require specific attention and probably tailored responses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your insights. And if I can try to summarize some of the great things you said, is that first, governance matters. And that in fragile and conflict-affected countries, you usually don't have that strong governance that helps vulnerable communities cope. So who are the actors in those settings that can step in and provide some of the valuable government services that are not serviced by the government? So in the case, this ICRC provides some of those, but in the light of the IPCC findings, we know that, for example, there will be massive movements of people with climate. How are we going to address that? Our record as the international community with dealing with displacement is appalling. How are we going to envision a much better and resilient human mobility system by 2030, when we're going to be very close or at 1.5, if we don't address climate in an ambitious way? So these are some of the questions that I have, and that perhaps we can delve into the Q&A. But for now, Chris, if you can bear with us, I'll go to the DPR of Mozambique. Mozambique is the first time that has been in the Security Council. I feel a kindred spirit here because I also served in the council for the first time when Guatemala was an elected member. So it is with a great pleasure and honor to welcome our IPI friend, Ambassador Domingos Fernandes. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Well, good afternoon to everyone. I have a colleague of mine sitting there. Mr. Nyakota is accompanying me. And because he's watching on me, I'll make sure that I use my notes, otherwise I'll be in trouble. Okay, well, first of all, I would like to start by thanking the International Peace Institute, Geneva Peace Building Platform, and all the organizers of this event in New York on the current and emerging challenges to building sustainable peace. I'm also grateful for the invitation to come and talk to this audience and the opportunity to share some of our thoughts on this important and timely topic. Our appreciation also goes to the members of this panel on addressing climate change through just transitions. Well, Mozambique is always concerned when it comes to this issue because it has been one of the countries which suffers the impact of climate heavily. So we are deeply concerned with the increasingly and devastating impact of climate change, which pose a risk not only to the development process, but also to the security as a whole. In fact, Mozambique, like other countries in Africa, it has been directly suffering from the effects of climate change due to its location. For this reason, and because it believes there is an increasing potential for conflicts to arise as a result of the effects of climate change, the country has identified this issue as one of its priority during its ongoing mandate as non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So we intend to bring this issue to the Security Council, especially when during our President's Month. Mozambique also has been experiencing some of these extreme events on a cyclical basis, such as cyclones, floods, and droughts that affect its population, particularly in rural areas, with consequences for food security, poverty, and displacement that can be a source of conflict. Mozambique has been hit by several cyclones in recent years, causing significant damage and loss of life. In March 2023, for instance, a cyclone Freddy made a landfall twice in Mozambique, breaking records for the duration and strength of tropical storms in the southern hemispheres. The storm caused severe damage and cut off children and families from critical services, with more than 500,000 people at risk of being affected. The extent of the damage and the number of casualties were not clear due to the blackout in communication and the electricity supply in the storm areas. It is worth to note that prior to Cyclone Freddy, Mozambique was hit by two other major cyclones called Idai and the other one Kenneth. Both effects are still being felt up to date. The country is also facing poverty and terrorism in the north. So many things together at the same time. Oh, sorry. So addressing climate change through just transition involves recognizing and addressing social and economic impacts of climate action, particularly vulnerable communities. We cannot ignore this. The government of Mozambique, due to that, the government of Mozambique, with the support of national and international partners, including the United Nations, has been responding directly to citizens affected by extreme events. At a broader level, it has been designing more holistic and sustainable responses to reduce the long-term effects of the climate change. Mozambique has also been implementing programs to strengthen technical, financial, and infrastructure capacity in cities and regions prone to extreme events. The country has designed and implemented an early warning system to track potential hazards well in advance, take early action, and minimize the impact on people and property. The system combines new technology, infrastructure, and community action to alert communities located in disaster-prone areas. Trained local community brigades educate and alert communities about impending hazards, helping them prepare and stay safe during extreme weather events. Now, let me share with you some lessons learned based on our own experience. The first one, commitment and collaboration between government and partners have proven to be very crucial in Mozambique's approach and response to the effects of climate change. It has been a permanent exercise in dialogue and learning that allows us to reduce damage in extreme events, as was evident in Cyclone Freddy in January 2023, where the early warning system saved many lives. Second, the involvement of local communities in the design and implementation of resilience programs has allowed greater awareness and participation. Consequently, a better response. So it has been a remarkable collaboration. Before I conclude, let me indicate that Mozambique, the United Arab Emirates, and Switzerland are co-chairing the informal expert group of the Security Council members on climate, peace, and security. The group is working systematically and regularly to learn and contribute to the recognition of the effects of climate change as priorities and to coordinate fair and equitable responses. And finally, I would like to reiterate our commitment at all levels in prioritizing its action and capacity to the best response to climate change in the country, in Mozambique. So in few words, this is what I wanted to share with you. And I thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you so much for bringing the experience of Mozambique. I think it helps us ground the conversation on a specific reality, and it helps us also understand the nuances that countries are facing on a day-to-day reality. Climate is no longer an issue of the future; it's very much with us as we are now in a 1.1 world. You also said in some of the lessons learned that one of the biggest things is commitment and collaboration. And I think that that's really, really important as we start to face this like compending challenges and that the early warning systems, which we know that the SG wants that every person is protected by 2027 with early warning systems. So that's a commitment we support from the SG's office. The other great thing is this informal expert group of the Security Council, right? So at the formal level, at the official level, the Security Council seems very stuck on climate. I was there when the first and only PRSD was adopted in 2012. And since then, the only way the Security Council has managed to get climate into the texts is through regional mandates, through specific mandates. But we still do not have a standalone text on climate, peace, and security through the Security Council. Perhaps that's also an opportunity because, as you know, none of the most vulnerable countries sit in the P5 seat. And we have the major emitters with a veto power in the Security Council. So it's also very important to understand the limitations of the Council in climate. And it's countries like Mozambique, like the small island developing states that calls them the superpowers in climate, that really need to lead the voice. And that voice is loud and clear in COP. So it's important that as we start thinking of a global architecture on peace and security, how do we build those links? And how do we make sure that the vulnerable voices remain in the lead? With that, I think we may have more thoughts from you in the Q&A, but now I will turn to Christophe, who is in Somalia. Thank you also for staying with us. I don't even know what time is in Somalia, but you're the first ever climate security advisor. And so we would love to hear from you. Over to you. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you to IPI and everybody there. And thanks to my fellow panelists, and thanks for inviting me. Yes, it is quite late, but it's good to be here with everybody. So I'm just going to sort of share a bit around some of the learnings. So yes, so it's interesting what you were saying around the fact that there's no global Security Council decision on this, but as you said, there has been sort of localized mandates. And so Somalia does have in its language talking about risk and risks of climate change. So it really talks about recognizing the adverse effects of climate change, ecological changes, natural disasters, among other factors, on the stability. So it talks about how climate change impacts the stability of Somalia. And basically the mandate that I'm sort of brought in to do is to look at how do you look at undertaking comprehensive climate risk assessments and risk management strategies. And so I was going to talk a bit around, where we are in Somalia and sort of provide a bit of the sort of realities. I mean, so Somalia really is currently in one of its worst flooding in the last probably 6 or 7 decades. We're trying to still get the sort of the river levels and the details of rain, but yes, there are huge amounts of water, and large parts of the Shebele and the Juba are underwater at the moment, which is massively impacting large amounts of the populations. And this is on the back of the worst drought in the last 4 decades. So we can see that cyclical event of floods and droughts is actually the reality now happening on the ground. And we can say that there's a 3-fold increase in climatic events since 1990. So there's droughts, floods, storms. And so this, as Catherine was saying, there's no linear interlinkage between climate and conflict and climate and impacts in areas, but what we can see is that there's a definite increase in the number of climatic shocks. And what we can see in Somalia is, if we look at the weathering risk report done by Delphi and others, we can see that Somalia is on the projections to very high likely to between 3 and 3.4 degrees by 2080. So air temperature overall Somali is going to, in the overall part of Somalia, is going to be in the around the 3.4 degree mark, unless we hit the Paris agreements. Heat-related deaths will increase, sea level rise will increase, but with quite high levels of scientific certainty, we know that this inter-annual variability of floods and droughts is going to continue. We also know that water availability is likely to drop, and the projections are that Somalia will actually receive half of its water needs by 2080. So these projections are quite scary and quite worrying, but it's often, as Catherine was saying, as others were saying, it's the countries that are most vulnerable are the ones that are going to be hardest hit. And so this does mean that there's going to be more climate-related deaths, humanitarian disasters, and human suffering, unless we do something globally around hitting the 1.5 agreement, the Paris Agreement. But it does mean also that there will be increased displacement, as we're seeing already now with the floods and the droughts, which will lead to insecurity and tensions. So this interlinkage between climate and security is really key here, which means that there's also going to be more competition over scarce natural resources. And one of the things that Catherine mentioned a bit around was this lack of assistance or lack of governance at the local levels, means that can or is increasing reliance on other actors, non-state actors. So as Catherine was saying, there's no sort of real direct link, but climate change, such as climate change impacts, does lead to resource competition, and that resource competition and climate impacts does lead to economic collapse, poor or limited governance, breakdown of social cohesion, and exclusion and marginalization. And this does lead to insecurity, and that insecurity can lead to, can be seen as either intra-household or national state or transnational insecurity. And when we look at the pathways between climate change and insecurity, there are sort of four general theories around climate and conflict. And one is around livelihoods, so competition over resources such as water and grazing lands. Migration, we've talked a bit about before, around movement of populations. And this movement of population can lead to competition over land. It can lead to maladaptation, so increased chopping of trees or moving to areas that are not environmentally sustainable. This does mean that there is an increase in armed actors or other non-state actors, and we talked a bit about this, about the legitimacy over land, water. In Somalia, for example, Al-Shabaab are also increasing their control over natural resources through bombing, polluting water wells. They're also using natural resources as a type of control mechanisms. There's a realization now more and more in Somalia that stabilization and trying to work through working with communities on this competition over resources and natural resources is really important. And so that's where we're really trying to focus a lot of our work. So I just wanted to, so that's the sort of broad concept. And what are we doing now in Somalia? What we're trying to do is several things. One is really trying to work from a point of view of data and information. And so what we've been really trying to do is look at these projections and trying to mainstream those into the big strategic documents across the country. So this is the economic plan, this is the national development plans, this is how do we look at the national adaptation plans, the reconciliation plans, the stabilization and security planning, because obviously this is the new reality. So like, for example, the offensive against Al-Shabaab was hopefully going to be a much more advanced than it is, but now because of the El Nino effect, it's come to a stall. So now we're starting to think about next year. What does the weather forecast patterns mean? What does that mean for the sort of the military offensive, but what does it mean for security and stabilization and the conflict dynamics as well? So a lot of it is around mainstreaming first and getting awareness across all the stabilization and security actors, but it's also around data. So now we have several data platforms working with different partners, And in that data platform, we're doing quite a lot of work around how do we understand where water points are, where grazing lands are, where transhumance movement of populations are. We're starting to be able to track things like soil moisture content. And with soil moisture, we can actually try to then see conflict dynamics and how those dynamics are changing. So we have 2 pilot programs working in the Hirshabelle state, looking at specifically this interrelation between soil health, how it all works, and then looking at conflict dynamics. And then we are working on interventions with communities to try to find solutions to those changes in conflict dynamics. And part of that we are also doing around natural resources. So rather than focusing on the political side, it's also looking at natural resource sharing agreements and building the sort of conflict dynamics, peace building through natural resources, and specifically through a nature-based solutions approach. So thinking about things like how can you actually look at swales, sand dams, different vegetative gabion walls, different types of now tested nature-based solutions that can help reduce some of the tensions and provide more environmentally sustainable approaches. But I think the last bit, I'll just come to a sort of close here, but the 3 main learnings I think we're getting to is one is around really, really important to work on data and mainstreaming and awareness raising and having the right data that can track and look at conflict dynamics, but also environmental hotspots and how environmental degradation with conflicts are actually now overlapping itself. And a lot of the conflicts are environmentally driven, and they will be more and more. And then through that is working with communities to build this sort of peace approach to natural resource management, this nature-based solutions, and looking at specific technical approaches with communities on sharing resources and what that means for the future as those resources get more and more scarce. And then obviously the last bit is around coordination. As my role in the resident coordinator's office, I'm trying to bring a lot of the different partners together. And as Catherine was saying, we can't do it alone. It has to be humanitarian, security, and development actors working together in the same place. So this is really, when we talk about climate security, I like to talk about how do we really focus on water security in collaboration with food security, because it's all around the same ecosystems. Also the same thing about energy security, human security, and environmental security. And unless we do those together across the humanitarians who start and do the interventions and work around some of the life-saving interventions, but trying to work in collaboration with the sort of security, stabilization, and the development actors, that's the only way we're really going to get there. So I think a lot of it is around really trying to do that on the ground, and we are trying to do that now. We have several joint programs across UN agencies with NGOs and CSOs, with the government in collaboration. And as you said, the only way we can do this is through multilateralism, and that is the way we have to do that on the ground as well, together. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Christophe. I thought that was fantastic and really, really great to hear how, in a way, your work in Somalia is kind of a new, I think, a new area, an arena that the UN will have to kind of step in a lot more. I do envision more advisors in different parts of the world as this becomes kind of the new normal. It's also kind of shocking to me that Somalia is in floods, because you always hear Somalia in droughts. So for those of us that are not based there or close to the country, it's incredible to hear that droughts and floods are being magnified, right? And then if there is a flood, how can we develop, for example, rain catching systems or other type of systems that collect the water so that when there's drought, so how can you actually use the climate impacts for our benefits? How can we find the seeds and the type of biodiversity that is needed to ensure food security? How can we change diets from perhaps like a more fish-based diet, because Somalia has an amazing coast. But so there's so many things to work on at a multiple levels, right? And your presentation also made me think of loss and damage. I've been very much involved in the loss and damage discussion as an advisor for the Minister of the Maldives. And we have just designed a new fund on loss and damage. And for those of you that don't know what loss and damage is, in a basic forms is what happens when you when climate crosses a point where there's basically no return. For example, at 1.5, we will lose all warm coral reefs. In Somalia, you mentioned that if we reach 1.5, Somalia will experience 3.4 degrees. That is a staggering number. So what will be the loss and damage in Somalia, and how can Somalia then benefit from a fund that is primarily catered for governments that have governments? How will others be able to access funding in situations of conflict and fragile institutions? So much to think about. Another point that you made, and also Catherine made, is the climate's not linear. So that's also kind of an important lesson that we can bring in the Q&A. So I would like to open it for a brief Q&A. We plan to end at 4:30, if not before. Are there any questions from our lovely audience? Yeah. I think there's a mic coming, no? Yeah, just, you can, no, because of we have an online presence, so. Yeah.
Sorry, who was it?
Thank you for your presentations. My question is with regard to extractive industries and that which lies below the earth, or below the land, and the people on top of the land, and specifically the fossil fuel industry and the minerals industry. And I'll bring up 3 cases connected to human rights and migration. One is the Uyghur community in China, in Xinjiang province, which has the largest oil reserves underneath, and what's happening there with regard to the movement of the population and also the genocide, according to the United States, that's taking place. Secondly, the Rohingya community in Arakan State, which has a tremendous amount of mineral reserves underneath, the extraction, and once again, the displacement, forced displacement of the population, as well as the environmental impacts. And lastly, mention the situation just off the shore of Gaza, where you have the gas extraction taking place significantly, and then the forced displacement on Gaza, and one wonders what the plans are for that future land that's being depopulated. So I wanted to bring that in and ask you how that ties into the latest human right from your perspective, a right to a healthy, safe, and clean environment. Thank you. R2HE, I think it's called.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Are there other questions? Yeah, here, the lady in the sweater.
Hi there, my name is Roesch, and I work downstairs for Pathfinders, NYU. My question has to do with the green transition part of this panel. I've just returned from Indonesia to where I was running a workshop on just transitions and inequality. And the question that I have is basically, sometimes policies, like just transition policies themselves, can create instability because there are very real winners and losers in that process. And the question is, I mean, how do you account for that through maybe social dialogue or mediation or negotiation? Like, what are the processes that take place to kind of mitigate even the impacts of particular policies that are well-meaning but have very real consequences for particular communities, whether they're coastal workers or women or different groups of people. And if it's not done correctly, even well-meaning policies will fail. And I'm interested in your thoughts in around that area. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Roshni. Great question as well. Third question, anyone else? No? Okay, so perfect. So I'll turn to our speakers. I think there's 2 main questions. The first one is on extractive in oil industries, and how do we make sure we try to protect vulnerable communities in those circumstances. And the second question is on just transitions and on how we make sure, as basically that's kind of like the whole momentum around just transition. How do we make sure that the transition towards decarbonization is done in a way that it's planned and that it provides support for those that are being affected by the shifts. Who would like to start? Please raise your hand. Catherine, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you. On the extractive industries question, I don't think I'm the best position to react. On the question of green transition and losers and winners and taking into account the impacts of communities, there I would make a connection. So as an organization, we work at a very local level with communities, which means that we are not helping implementing state policies. That's not the role of a humanitarian organization in most cases. But in my earlier remarks, I was alluding to the fact that it's extremely important when we plan responses to take into account the social and political and historical reality of the place we work in. And I would apply that to that question, and noting that, yes, it's absolutely true that whatever type of support might be provided to communities, and if we're looking at how do you transition from types of energy and what type of support comes with that, there will be implications in terms of who holds power, who loses power, who gains power, and these have to be taken into account. So there, I think we're getting back to the same question of having a good understanding of community dynamics and being able to look at what are the longer term implications of our action in that case on the social political dynamics and so on in a country. If I may, while I have the floor, I did want to comment on the question of human mobility. You alluded to this, Laura and Christopher as well did. The question of, in some cases, displacement, in some cases, migration as an adaptation mechanism. So displacement more or less as a coping mechanism, migration as an adaptation mechanism, is an important one. I think we all need to consider that most movements are happening at an internal level inside countries and not across borders. And that's very much the level at which we need to be looking. Now, one of the tensions that we face as a humanitarian organization with regards to displacement or non-displacement is precisely that. At which point, when we provide support in given environments, are we to some extent enabling maladaptation by helping people stay in place in environments that are becoming less and less livable? And this is one of the tensions that we struggle with, in the sense that, I mean, a typical humanitarian response will help people stay in place should they wish to, and of course will not prevent people from moving. But the concern is, at which point is that response becoming a bad response for the communities we work with? And I don't know what's the answer, but I do think when we're looking at mobility, we also need to be looking at when is mobility the right response, and the response that should be encouraged with the right type of information and administrative support and so on and so forth. So I did want to add that on the mobility question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Christophe, over to you. And if I may add a question of my own in a way is, I just lost my train of thought, so I'll let you respond first, and then I will come back to my own.
Okay. So, I mean, I think on the extractives questions, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. And I think that to some extent, what we talk about competition over resources at the local level is happening at a global level. And I think that as competition towards the green transition happens, I think that there will also be increases in geopolitical interests and geopolitical conflicts. And so I think that there's a wider question around the fact that we all need to recognize this. And I think that we all need to have some sort of wider discussion around the green transition and what it means for extractives. I think that the issue around human rights is another one that needs to be incorporated into that. I don't think, I mean, I think we all need to sort of recognize that there are important global set of values that we should all be sticking to. But I guess that goes back to that question of multilateralism and the fact that we should, this global set of rules, are we adhering to them or not? So I think that there are certain aspects that I think are interesting that still need to be discussed on that. But I think it's again probably not in my remit to discuss that. But I think on the policy question, I think it's really interesting around how do we account through dialogue of this sort of how policies itself can create instabilities, and it does create winners and losers. I think that's to a certain extent it's true, but I think it's again one of these parts of to move forward, we do need to have policies to be able to ensure there is some sort of regulatory framework to be able to implement certain aspects. But I think, as Catherine was saying, part of this is understanding the political and the community and the whole dynamics. And so a real understanding of the political, economic, and the sort of dynamics going on is key. And without that, we can't really understand, we can't really do proper policy work that also helps with the proper community bottom-up design of programs and how it should move forward. So I think that at the moment, yes, it does. But I think, as Catherine was saying, if there's a real true indication and ownership and understanding of the dynamics and put that in and being open about it, I think that's really key. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much. And Ambassador, over to you. And if you can also address kind of how do you see the role of the Council evolving as we move into this 1.5 world?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. If we take in account that amongst the members of the Security Council, we still have a difference in terms of how we address this issue. If you take the issue of climate change itself and its linkage with the conflict, there is a huge debate, even including the P5 members. And then I'm not going to say what is the position of each of them, but the Security Council, it has got challenges to address properly this issue because of, on one hand, because of that, and also because this issue, it's still one of those issues that a lot of research is still going on. So, but the linkage is there, and especially when it comes, I'm going to give an example. For instance, where the conflict is, and you have the effects of climate change, and then the combination of these two things, they are mostly they have a deadly effect, and that's why at the end then it becomes a security issue, and therefore it's important that the Security Council be kept abreast on this issue, because it's a cross-cutting issue as well, and we need to give it due attention. So maybe I can bring in that sense. And then obviously, when I mentioned about the informal group, it has been working on this. Because one, we are concerned about the safety of the children, and also other effects that climate and combination of conflict can bring to the societies. So we need to give due attention and address properly. I'm not sure what I answered, but well, it was an attempt.
I think it was a great answer for a very complicated issue. Colleagues, thank you very much. I have like 5 key points that I've learned through this event of Geneva meets New York meets COP. The first one is that collaboration, partnership, and coordination are kind of remain the key cornerstone of climate, whether it's on the side of sustainable development or on peace. We need those 3 as main pillars on the way forward. The second one is that conflict-affected countries and fragile environments need tailored responses and need unique policies that fit within their own context. The third one is data and the need to invest more in data so that the responses do not lead to maladaptation, but actually to sustainable and coherent policies. The fourth one is governance. Governance matters, and Pathfinders has been one of the leaders on SDG 16. How do we connect SDG 16, the peace pillar in the SDG framework, with SDG 13, climate and COP? This cannot be seen as odds, but really as one path merging together. And the fifth and last point is policies. Right now, we are heading into COP, and we do have an opportunity to start building policies that build on that first point of collaboration, partnership, and coordination. And stay tuned, we'll have an active Twitter and LinkedIn with our partners at COP, so I hope you follow us there. Thank you. And over to Adam.
Great, thank you, Jimena. This brings us to the end of a tremendous day. Before we close, I just want to thank the government of Switzerland again. Thanks to the Geneva Peace Building Platform. It's been tremendous. Thanks to all our partners in Geneva, including GCSP, I should say. Hi to Natica as well. We began the day talking about the need to enhance cooperation between International Geneva and the institutions in New York. We've touched a bit on human rights, but tomorrow morning we're gonna address it directly with our 4th panel, promoting human rights and inclusive society, starting at 9 a.m. So I invite you all to come back tomorrow morning, join us online again, and then we'll have a panel, following panel on AI, and a closing panel with the president of Interpeace, among others, and I think the ambassador of Switzerland will be back. It's going to be a great morning, so please join us again. Thank you for taking part all day. Really appreciate it.